This is All Out Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. Well, time now for our daily debate. And with Brexit negotiations underway between the UK and the European Union, business groups are lobbying hard to have their say. Many are demanding a trade-friendly final deal that puts the economy first. Some businesses are concerned that their company will lose out on valuable skills and labour. So what is the impact of Brexit likely to be for UK businesses? Well, we're joined by Harry Newman, who is director at the policy think tank Open Europe and a former special advisor to the Cabinet Office and the Ministry of Justice, and by Stephen Purvis, chairman of Policy North, a think tank for the development of the north of England. If I could start with you, Mr. Purvis, obviously these discussions are getting underway. What do you think the impact is going to be on business, both in terms of profitability, but also in terms of getting the right workers of Brexit?
I think in any business negotiation, the key that we're really looking for is some element of stability and surety. And that's certainly, I think, what's perhaps lacking in negotiations at the moment. So the impact on capital markets of instability is probably the greatest risk to business, followed rapidly by skills. And certainly Policy North, being very focused in the north of England, sees a huge potential risk to already unemployment rates that are 42% higher than the national average. So the supply chain surety of highly skilled workers is critically important to the northeast and the north in general if it is to continue its growth. So I think stability, certainty and some protection around the availability of particularly highly skilled workers is what business is asking for.
And also, when you talk about the northeast, people think of the car industry. You've got to have some system where parts can move about between Europe and here.
Yeah, of course, Nissan is a huge part of the northeast economy, and long may that continue. One of the proposals being put forward by Policy North has been the concept of a free port, effectively a tariff and duty-free zone for the import of raw materials and the export of those finished goods. And we think that could potentially, over the next 5 years, double the northeast already positive balance of trade, the only region in the UK with a positive balance of trade, to £25 billion and potentially create 2,000 jobs. And I think these are the sort of numbers and real progress that the business are looking for, potentially from a swift and certain Brexit.
Now, I mean, these are the sort of issues which were raised before the referendum. We now are on the way out. Do you get the sense now that we are getting down to the nitty-gritty of considering those sort of serious problems in these negotiations that are underway between David Davis and Michel Barnier?
I think we're certainly starting to hear more about that, but it does feel that the argument's been rather circular, as you suggest. And I think we're still discussing key elements, whether we should be in the customs union or the single market, and we'd certainly expect it to be a little bit beyond that by now. But I think the most important thing to say is that Brexit itself is not either good or bad for business. It's the policies that the government adopts afterwards and how we leave, and in the speed with which we leave, the interim arrangements that we have in place, and so on. So Open Europe's got a particular vision of Brexit, which I think would enjoy the backing of a lot of businesses, but also people who voted leave and remain.
Would you say that in the interests of business, both in terms of trade and in terms of access to labour, Britain will have to give way on this question of freedom of movement?
I don't think we have to give way on free movement overall. I think we can certainly, as the Leave campaign had it, take back control of our borders, and we can have control over who comes in and also information about who's here and who's not here, and we can certainly put new restrictions.
The information is different from stopping people coming in there.
Sure, but we don't have particularly good information at the moment either. The government doesn't really have a complete database of who's actually in the country. But I think we also need to listen to business, and certainly from our point of view, we wouldn't be wanting to see an immigration system that was overly restrictive, but it equally has to meet the mandate from the country for a system of which Parliament has control.
What do you think, Mr. Purvis? I mean, does Britain need to start being more flexible on control of borders in order to protect business interests?
Well, I agree with Henry that Brexit is potentially neutral. It's the policies that follow that are critical. I think what business needs to see is safety around that supply chain. And it's also, I think, important to remember that the EU is actually only 44% of our trade in total. 56% is with non-EU countries. And actually, I think business would rather see a more all-encompassing import of talent to the UK, not specifically just with EU citizens, but also with world talent. Increasingly, increasingly we're recruiting from North America, from the Far East, from South America. So it isn't just our near neighbours in Europe. Actually, business needs a broader and more comprehensive strategy for bringing in talent as we're increasingly globalised, particularly in high growth technology, pharmaceutical and biotech.
Do you agree with that? I mean, this is the argument that perhaps we've been too focused on Europe and we ought to be looking more globally.
I think that's completely fair. I think also another point which is important to make is that the public's idea of high-skilled migration might differ from the ideas of economists. And for the public, high-skilled migrants might include nurses and care workers and others for whom they're happy to see come to the country in large numbers to work in the NHS and in the care system, as well as seeing specialists in IT and in engineering and so on. So I think we can design a immigration system for post-Brexit Britain that maintains public consent but also keeps our economy open.
Mr. Newman, Mr. Purvis, what has been the impact of EU migration on the north of England? I mean, people think back to the days of Auf Wiedersehen, Pet, when obviously the migration was in the other direction.
Absolutely. I think your point there is very interesting. There's been little talk about the reciprocal nature of the issue. So whilst the Prime Minister has made an offer to give 3 million EU citizens in the UK permanent right to remain and effectively British citizenship in terms of rights, there's been very little in businesses' view talk about what may happen to UK citizens working abroad. We have both sides of this problem. So we have EU staff highly skilled in the UK, and we want certainty that they will have the right to remain so that we can make longer term investment decisions. But we also have subsidiary businesses in Europe where there are UK citizens working there. And I think too little narrative has been dedicated to those rights. The finer detail of cut-off dates and transition periods, I think businesses perhaps less concerned with, but high-level surety around those big issues of movement is really important. It's what allows us to make 5, 10 and 20-year investment decisions.
As far as incoming migration is concerned, can you say that large numbers of EU citizens have come into the northeast and taken jobs that might have been held by people who were already there, or indeed bid down wages?
I don't think we have seen that. I certainly haven't seen numerical evidence to prove that. I think the challenge in the north is our productivity challenge. So as unemployment reduces, which is fantastic, it places further pressure on productivity. Where we have seen inflow of EU workers has actually been into lower skilled and lower paid jobs. So actually, I'm not sure it's having the wage pressure that you suggest. But we're certainly not seeing the volume. This morning, before the show, I checked, there are 2,000 software engineering and related jobs advertised in 20 miles of Newcastle. So there is clearly a void of talent there that clearly isn't being filled by a mass inflow from the EU. And there's work to be done there to broaden that recruitment net beyond the European Union.
So with these increased freedoms, Mr. Newman, I mean, do you think there is a chance that, I don't know, if you take a 10-year horizon, we will actually be better off as a result of Brexit?
Absolutely, I think that's very possible. I think, but I think so. We think we should leave the customs union, and that will enable us to sign new free trade deals. And I think free trade deals aren't a panacea in of themselves. We've heard quite a lot about them over the last few months, but it's a good thing for business confidence to have trade deals. And of course, the EU has recently signed a free trade deal with Canada, which could be a model for our trade deal.
But it is true around the world that the bulk of your trade tends to be with places that are close to you.
Absolutely. But we've done some modelling on this and found that billions of pounds of untraded potential are available to be met, and the UK could increase its exports very substantially. And some of this is with countries which are actually quite far away. Of course, as you say, countries tend to trade more with countries which are closer to them, but that's not necessarily entirely true. There's also other commonalities that are important: historical links, transport links, cultural links, rule of law, and so on. So I think we can. The other point to make is that our trade with the EU is particularly good on goods. It's not as good on services. And one of the problems about us trading into the EU is, first of all, there isn't a particularly good single market for services, but also that we don't share the same language with the rest of the EU. So actually, our services trade is to an extent hampered by the fact that we're overly focused on the EU to the extent of elsewhere in the world.
Stephen Purvis, I saw you nodding for much of that, and of course we should concentrate on services because they are the biggest aspect of UK trade. Where do you see the opportunities to do more business for UK services?
Well, firstly, at the highest level, I agree with Henry's point that we may well be much better off post-Brexit if this is handled correctly. And also that the proximity argument of trading with your nearest neighbours actually starts to be less relevant when you're trading in digital services and tertiary services rather than products. I think there are a few new lessons in global economics. So the latter half of the 18th century, the northeast of England per capita, GDP per capita, was the richest part not only of the UK but of the world. And actually, if you put it into today's terms, we had a GDP per head greater than Qatar. Now, stand fast recent events where we may well meet them on the way down. I think there's lessons to be learned there. And that wasn't trade with Europe. That was trade with the every single corner at the furthest extreme of the world. So leaving the customs union is key to enable the process of signing new trade deals. In the north, we have the GCC and the Arab Chamber of Commerce regularly visiting and making it very clear that they want to be at the front of the queue to sign a trade deal, and perhaps even do some pilot projects regionally in the north to make sure that they're very much at the front of that queue. And that's absolutely what we think is the future, certainly for the north. Not the northern powerhouse model of let's allow a buoyant southeast economy to prop up the north. No, let's allow the north to trade globally and actually rebalance that economy. If we could achieve parity with the southeast, ignoring London, that's £32 billion of GVA, which is a very significant boost. And that's really what's up for grabs here. So I agree with Henry that the post-Brexit future is potentially much brighter than where we were 2 years ago.
OK, thank you both very much indeed.